can have sight. You're talking about somebody who has the capability of seeing, but when he says to open my eyes, he's not talking about his physical eye. He's talking about his spiritual or his mental eye. Because he understands in the Torah there are wonders, and the only way we're going to see these wonders, the Most High has to open our eyes to see it. Anybody can read in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But how many of us know in that very first verse, he's laid out a plan? You're not going to see that, number one, just from the English. Because there are other things that's being revealed when you look at it from Hebrew. But just looking at it in Hebrew doesn't guarantee that you're going to see it, because something else Brother Shahu mentioned. She says, the eye haven't seen, the ear hasn't heard, neither has it entered into the heart of man what the Most High has prepared for those who love him, but he has revealed it to us by his Spirit. See? Just because you read in Hebrew doesn't mean you're going to see it either. That's all they spoke at one point. And they still missed it. Because Abba has to open your heart and mind to see it in order for us to receive it. Okay. Another passage ties right back into where we were quoting from, 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 10. Brother Shaul writes, it is to us, however, that Elohim has revealed these things. How? Through the Spirit. For the Spirit probes all things, even the profoundest depths of Elohim. So when people talk about being deep, and when they talk about getting deep, and people saying they going beneath the surface of the word, the only way we can do that, the Creator has to teach that to us. That's not something that we get on our own. Okay? And I just wanted to lay these out at the beginning. And these pillars of Bible study you're going to hear often referred to as we have various segments. As I mentioned earlier, it was talked about in previous segments along with the pillars of understanding Torah, and most high willing at another time we're going to lay those out so that you can at least have them, and you can maybe write them down, and you can go over those and rehearse those so that they'll be at the forefront of your mind. Okay, so let's turn over our board and let's get into our lesson for today. Who is Satan? Right? Now, the focal point for today's lesson is going to be defining the term. Defining the term. So we're going to look at several passages today in regard to the term as it's being used in Holy Scripture. Alright? Our first passage, however, is going to come from Bereshit, which is Genesis chapter 3, starting at verse 1. Now, the serpent was more subtle than any animal of the field which Yahweh Elohim had made. He said to the woman, has Elohim really said, you shall not eat of any tree of the garden? The woman said to the serpent, we may eat from the trees of the garden, but not the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden. Elohim has said, you shall not eat of it, you shall not touch it, lest you die. The serpent said to the woman, you won't really die. For Elohim knows that in the day you eat it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like Elohim, knowing good and evil. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took some of its fruit and ate, and she gave some to her husband with her, and he ate it too. Their eyes were open, and they both knew that they were naked. And I'm going to stop right there. Now, in this passage, we are actually introduced to the character of Hasatan. But we're going to circle back, and we're going to look at this passage a little later as a segue to our next topic of discussion, which will be, what is human nature? Okay? But as far as the term Satan itself, we're introduced to that in the book of Job, or Job. So you can turn to Job chapter 1, and we are going to pick up in verse 6, all right, which reads, Now, on the day when B'nai Ha'alahim, sons of the mighty ones, and when you hear that term, or the sons of God, but this goes to the point too, when you look at it in Hebrew or Hebrew, it's B'nai Ha'alahim. Okay, I just want to point that out, which is why you heard me say sons of the mighty ones. Okay, when we keep in line with what the Hebrew actually states. But nevertheless, sons of God will do for the time being. Now on the day when the sons of God came to present themselves before Yahweh, Hasatan also came among them. Now another point that we want to make in regard to this is that Hasatan is mentioned in connection with the sons of God. Okay, B'nai Ha'alahim. Now what does that mean? Well, the context of this particular passage as it relates to the sons of God or B'nai Ha'alahim is a reference to the Malachim or the angelic beings. Keep that in mind. And as we go through the lessons, other things are going to be brought out and some sense is going to be made as to why certain words were used and certain terms were mentioned so that we can come to a better understanding. Okay? But point being, this is one of the places where we are introduced to the term Satan. As you see on the board, it's in the Hebrew lexicon, number 7854. Again, the term is Satan, and it means an opponent. Okay? It's derived from another term, 7853, and we're going to look at that a little later on. All right? So the definition in Strong's, once again, it says an opponent, especially with the article prefixed, and it's talking about the definite article. It says Satan, the arch enemy of good. Now, here's what we want to do with that. All right, let me write this up on the board for you. You have your shin, and you have your tet, and you have your nun. Some people say nun Sophie. Now this is the word right here, Satan. Satan or Shatan. And that's how it would, that's the word itself. When it says with the definite article, and this is actually how it's written in Hebrew, Hasatan. So when I add that hey to it, that changes it, because remember the letter hey is the definite article and it means the, and it recognizes something specific. Okay? So it's not just Satan. It should say the Satan, but we're not going to say the Satan. You know, and that goes to the point that was made earlier in regard to Bible translations. So in most translations, when you get to that verse, in every verse in Job that pertains to Hasatan, even though in the Hebrew it says Hasatan, it's always mentioned as Satan. But what we want to do today, we want to read the remaining passages from Job, but we want to incorporate the term Hasatan by translating it as the opponent. Okay? The opponent. So, and let's see how that actually changes the meaning of it a little bit. So let's start back at verse 6 and let's read through. Now, on the day when the sons of God came to present themselves before Yahweh, the opponent also came among them. Yahweh said to the opponent, "Where have you come from?" Then the opponent answered Yahweh and said, "From going back and forth in the earth and from walking up and down in it." Put a pin in that. Okay? Keep that in mind, that the opponent said this is what he was doing. Okay? Verse 8. Yahweh said to the opponent, "Have you considered my servant YHWH. For there is no one like him in the earth, a blameless and an upright man, one who fears Elohim and turns away from evil. Then the opponent answered Yahweh and said, Does YHWH fear Elohim for nothing? Haven't you made a hedge around him and around his house and around all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But stretch out your hand now, and listen to the language here, and touch all that he has, and he will renounce you to your face. Now, as we're going through this, of course, our focal point, defining the term, but keep in mind the context of what it is that we're reading. Keep in mind this conversation between Yahweh and the opponent, because we're learning something here. We're learning a very valuable lesson here, and as we go through the different segments, we're going to be highlighting some of what we're learning, okay? He says, again, verse 11, But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will renounce you to your face. Yahweh said to the opponent, Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only on himself don't stretch out your hand. So the opponent went out from the presence of Yahweh. Now, what are we being taught? What we're being taught, the fact that it starts off that the sons of Elohim, they were gathered together, right? And who came among them? The opponent. The opponent, if you understand how it's being read, is indirectly being shown to have been one of the sons of Elohim, or one of the Malakim, the angelic beings. And we're going to get further into that as we go through each of the segments, but I just want to point certain things out right now. So when we think about the opponent, or another word you can say, the adversary, okay? Oftentimes, I'll incorporate, the adversary when talking about Hasatan, right? Now, here's the thought. Was Hasatan an adversary to humanity or an adversary to Yahweh? Now, I'm going to put that question out right there now, food for thought. And as we go through the different segments, various things are going to be brought out. Okay? And if you were following along and you went through the spirit of prophecy, there were certain things that were mentioned in the spirit of prophecy. If you remember, okay, the answer was already given. But it'll be reiterated. But I just want to bring it to your mind. All right? Now, let's continue. Let's go to Job chapter 2. Let's pick back up in verse 1. It says, Again, on the day when B'nai Ha'Elohim came to present themselves before Yahweh, the opponent came also among them to present himself before Yahweh. Yahweh said to the opponent, Where have you come from? The opponent answered Yahweh and said, From going back and forth in the earth and from walking up and down in it. Once again, put a pin in that, because we're going to look at that again. This is what the opponent does. Verse 3. Yahweh said to the opponent, Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him in the earth, a blameless and an upright man, one who fears Elohim and turns away from evil. He still maintains his integrity, although you incited me against him to ruin him without cause. Pay attention to the language. Okay? We're learning something. A very, very valuable lesson. Okay? Verse 4. The opponent answered Yahweh and said, Skin for skin? Yes, all that a man has he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will renounce you to your face. Yahweh said to the opponent, behold, he is in your hand. Only spare his life. So the opponent went out from the presence of Yahweh and struck Job with painful sores from the sole of his foot to his head. Again, what are we being taught from these examples in Holy Scripture? And I'm asking this question as food for thought to get that mind working, to get that spirit moving within you, so that Abba can open your heart, your mind, and start making some connections for you. Okay? Now, in the previous passage that we just read, Job chapter 1, Job chapter 2, along with this next passage we're about to read, okay, these are the only verses which utilize the term Hasatan. Okay? Why is that important to know? Well, when it's being used as Hasatan, once again the definite article, the Satan, it is referring to a specific entity. That's why it's important. Okay? Because now we talk about word usage, Hasatan. Now we see who is Yahweh talking to, Hasatan. But we're going to see something else here in Zechariah, which is Zechariah chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. This is the only other place that you find the term Hasatan used as it is written in Hebrew, which is Hebrew. All right. Now listen to this. He showed me Yahushua, the high priest, standing before Yahweh's Melech, or angel, and the opponent standing at his right hand to be his adversary. Yahweh said to the opponent, Yahweh rebuke you. The opponent, yes, Yahweh, who has chosen Jerusalem, rebuke you. Isn't this a burning stick plucked out of the fire? Now, in Zechariah chapter 3, Job chapter 1, Job chapter 2, these are the only places that incorporate the term Hasatan, teaching in those references and those references only, a specific entity is being referred to. All right? Now, based on this usage, right, here's a question. Why is Hasatan an adversary to the high priest Yahushua? Think about that. Again, this is food for thought. There's a reason behind it. If there was no reason behind it, Abba would not have inspired Zechariah to write it. There's a reason. Okay? What are we being taught indirectly? Okay? What are we being taught indirectly? So what we want to do, we're going to look at a couple other passages. And what we're doing, we're allowing Holy Scriptures now to be built. You know, line to line, precept to precept, a little here, a little there, like we talked about before, right? Okay. So in Exodus chapter 17, and we're going to read these passages in reverse because there's something that people need to see. All right? And let me say this one thing before I read those two passages. And what I'm about to mention, especially when I get into Exodus chapter 17, verses 15 and 16. Now, when you read it in the English, you're missing something. When you read it in Hebrew, something very important is being revealed. And we want to just read it here. But for those who have a familiarity with the Hebrew language, I encourage you, go back, look at these verses in Hebrew. Okay? Well, listen to what he said. Exodus chapter 17, starting at verse 15. Moshe built an altar and called its name Yahweh our banner. He said, Yah has sworn, Yahweh will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. That is very important. Very important piece right there. Right? Yah has sworn, Yahweh will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Now let me make this point. in one of the previous segments in regard to the different nations, it was mentioned, whether it be Egypt, whether it be Assyria, whether it be Babylon, whatever, Amalek, Edomites, etc. The idea is that you have Israel versus the world. Okay? Any nation that's mentioned is only a symbol of the world. Alright? So when you think about it, don't get so caught up into, well, who are the Amalekites today? It's representing the world system. Remember that image that Nebuchadnezzar dreamt about, the world system. Those four beasts, even though it was four of them, what we come to understand in John's revelation, they represent one entity. Okay? And you saw the development. You saw the growth. When Babylon came about, and then the Median Persia, and then Greece, and then Rome, you saw the expansion. This is what was happening with it. It was growing. Okay? Keep that in mind. So, what we're learning from this, and this is the point that we want to emphasize with verse 16, Yahweh will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. So the fact that Yahweh is going to war with Amalek, that shows that Amalek, to some degree, is an enemy. All right? We can glean that much indirectly, right? Okay, now let's go back up to Exodus chapter 17 and read verses 8 through 10. And listen to what's being said. It says, Then Amalek came and fought with Israel in Rephidim, right? So he came, he fought with Israel. So what that teaches us is that Amalek was also an enemy to Israel. Okay? Verse 9. Moshe said to Yahushua, now this is what we want to do. This Yahushua that's being spoken of is the successor of Moshe, or Joshua. The Yahushua that we read about in Zechariah is a different Yahushua, but what we want to do, we want to make a comparison, because guess what? There's similar names that's being used. And that Yahushua was a high priest. That's teaching us something. Yes, it's two different people who both bear the name of Yahushua, but there's a message that's being given. Because remember what we're talking about. Who is Satan? And we're defining the term, right? So in Zechariah, it said that Yahushua and Hasatan, they stood in a sense of being adversaries. They were against one another, right? Now we're learning something else about Yahushua, who Moshe said, once again, Exodus chapter 17, verse 9. Moshe said to Yahushua, choose men for us and go out, fight with Amalek. Listen to that. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with Elohim's rod in my hand. So Yahushua did as Moshe had told him and fought with Amalek. We're only mentioning this as a reference point. Okay? So we know and we understand that Yahweh is going to war from generation to generation with Amalek. So Amalek must be an enemy to Yahweh. Amalek fought with Israel. So Amalek must be an enemy to Israel. So Moshe, who in the stead of Yahweh incorporates Yahushua or Joshua to fight against Amalek. Keep these things in mind. Okay? Now, let me say this much. The focal point is Amalek and what Amalek represents. But Abba willing, in another segment, another lesson altogether, these points are going to be brought up to bring out another truth if Abba allows. Okay? But just keep that in mind. So let's move on. Now, those are the passages utilizing the term Hasatan. Those are the only passages as was mentioned. Now we're going to look at the use of the term without the definite article, which is going to be a little different. So, the first passage we want to look at is in 1 Chronicles chapter 21 and verse 1. Alright? Which reads, it says, an adversary, that's our term right there. An adversary stood up against Israel and moved Dawid to take a census of Israel. Okay? Now, we want to compare this verse with another verse in 2 Shemuel or 2 Samuel chapter 24 verse 1. Why are we making this comparison? Excuse me. Because it's talking about the exact same event. But listen to how it's worded in 2 Samuel 24 verse 1. Again, Yahweh's anger burned against Israel, and he moved Dawid against them, saying, Go, count Israel and Yahudah. Now, when we compare these two passages, right, which speak of the exact same event, what we are being taught is that Yahweh became an adversary to Israel. That's all we're being taught. When you hear that, people may be scratching their head. What do you mean the Most High is an adversary or an enemy to Israel? If you have any background knowledge of the Old Testament, and I'm going to use Old Testament because that lays out the history of Israel, you wouldn't even ask that question. You know why? Because you will see the history of Israel and everything they did, which was totally contrary to the Most High. He lays it all out for us. So it's not unusual that the Most High be against them because of a lot of the evil that Israel was prone to do. Okay? But what we wanted to show, that it was not Hasatan that stood against Israel. No, because now we're looking at the word and how it's being used in its general use. Adversary. And in this context, Yahweh himself became an adversary, an opponent to Israel. That's all these two passages are teaching us. This is not saying in any way, shape, or form that Yahweh is Satan or anything like that, which has been misconstrued by some. That's not what it's saying. Alright? But it's showing how the Most High has become an adversary. And that's one passage that utilizes it. We're going to look at another passage now. In Bamidbar, which is Numbers chapter 22, verse 22. It states, Elohim's anger burned because he went, and Yahweh's Melech, or angel, placed himself in the way for an adversary against him. That's our word right there, Satan, an adversary. Now he was riding on his donkey, and his two servants were with him. Again, what we see, a reference to Yahweh being an adversary, but this time he was an adversary or an opponent to Balaam. Okay? It is not in any way, shape, or form saying that Yahweh is Hasatan. The word Satan is being used in its general form, simply meaning an opponent or an adversary. Okay? Which is not unusual. Now, a few other passages that utilize the term as an adversary